All right, welcome back to another week of the workshop in the history of material text. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department. I co-organized the seminar with John Pollock of the Kislak Center and also two other organizers who are not able to be with us tonight. Jerry Singerman, who's the humanities editor emeritus of the Penn Press and is picking up Liliana Weisberg at the airport because he's a good person. And Priya Namrath, who's our Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, who's away at a conference like a good graduate student, but is joining us very kindly on Zoom and helped us to get everything set up, even from very far away. So we appreciate that. John, do you have the sign-in sheet?
It's going around.
Okay. We're a little discombobulated without Priya, but we're getting there. So they'll both be back next week. They send their regrets, JC. They'll be back next week when we'll welcome Dee Andrews and Christopher Parmenter talking about Thomas Clarkson and the uses of print in abolitionism. The sign-in sheet is going around. Add your email to it if you're not on our listserv and would like to be. You can also let us know in the chat on Zoom if you want to be added, and we'll make sure that gets done. Those of you on Zoom, please make sure you're muted. During Q&A, use the raise hand function. We'll call on you to ask your question live, or you can put your question in the chat, and John Pollock will be monitoring the chat today and trying to do a decent job of it. Okay, well, it's great to have our own J.C. Cloutier back at the workshop. It's just you're not going to be as good as Priya. So we know that. Well, it's great to have JC back at the workshop. JC came to Penn in 2013 after finishing his graduate work at Columbia. And while working in the special collections there, he discovered the manuscript of Claude McKay's novel, Amiable with Big Teeth, which was published by Penguin in 2017, co-edited by JC and Brent Hayes Edwards. And when something like that happens to you, I assume, the crucial thing is to be nimble enough to deal with it. And I believe JC's whole dissertation transformed at that moment. Certainly the next decade of his scholarly career transformed at that moment. And emerging from that discovery, a large part of JC's material text work over the past decade has focused on the problems and pleasures of archives. His first book was Shadow Archives, the Life Cycles of African American Literature, Columbia 2019, that explores Black special collections. It resurfaces a number of texts that have been hidden, and it shows how the novel functioned as an archive of preservation for Black authors when more traditional routes of historical archiving in libraries was excluded. He's also worked on the photographs of Gordon Parks, and through his archival work, he and a curator at the Art Institute of Chicago were able to reunite some of Parks's photos with Ralph Ellison's essay, Harlem is Nowhere, and his Invisible Man. That resulted in an exhibit at the Art Institute and a catalog.
Yeah.
Right. Amiable with Big Teeth was translated into French in 2021, and this leads to the other major part of JC's work, translation, with an emphasis on Québécois or French Canuck and the works of Jack Kerouac. And in 2015, he spoke to this workshop on Kerouac's French manuscript of Sur le Chemin, which that novel appeared from Gallimard in 2023. JC also published a collection of Kerouac's other French writings, La Vie est Dommage, from Boreal in 2016, and two of his novels in the Library of America series. So JC's currently working on a book for Columbia called Big American Writer, Jack Kerouac, Bilingualism and the Archive, for which he won and then had rescinded by Elon Musk an NEA fellowship. He's also writing a book on posthumousness in American literature, and an essay on McKay's Romance in Marseille from this project has just come out in American Literary History. Today's talk is drawn from the Kerouac book, so please join me in welcoming JC back to the workshop to tell us about Kerouac's bilingual manuscript notebooks.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for having me. It's great to be back in the workshop. Like Zach said, last time I presented here was 10 years ago. So I guess I It took a long time to get me back here. But back then, I was just a fresh-faced young lad hoping not to embarrass myself. Now I have a few gray hairs and I don't mind embarrassing myself, which is the true gift of tenure, I hear. So what I'll be sharing with you today, as Zach said, is part of a book I just completed on Kerouac, one that's 15 years in the making. It's a mix of criticism and biography in which I try to reposition Kerouac in his actual geopolitical and cultural linguistic reality as a bilingual, bicultural, and ethnic author rather than as the mythic king of the beats hitchhiking on the road to white privilege. Let me now do the sharing. Forgot to do that. Good. Okay. So through a focus on Kerouac's experimental French and bilingual writings, the book also aims to reconsider Kerouac's oeuvre as an embodiment of the Franco-American experience within continental North America. What's often elided about from the Kerouac story is really the fundamentals, namely that he's a second-generation French-Canadian immigrant to the US. His parents were born in Quebec, Canada, and then migrated south into New England. This migration was part of what Quebec historians have called the Exodus and the Great Hemorrhage that saw close to 1 million French-speaking Canadians migrate into the US between 1840 and 1930. A century earlier, the expulsion of the Acadians by the British had already taken place. Now, most of those would go to Louisiana and give rise to Cajun and Bayou French. Kerouac is part of that same French-speaking American diaspora, which is marked by forced displacement and labor migration. He was born and baptized Jean-Louis Kerouac, and his mother tongue was French, specifically a North American French that evolved on this continent for about 3 centuries. When Kerouac was growing up and came to maturity in the 1920s and 30s, prejudice against French Canadians within the US and Canada was high, and the possibility of any sort of national literature in what came to be called Québécois French was non-existent. Both of these factors are key to understanding what became Kerouac's compositional practices as a writer and self-translator. As he put it in his journal 1951, when he was 29 years old, "Il faut vivre en anglais, c'est impossible de vivre en français." You have to live in English, it's impossible to live in French. This is the secret thought of the Canuck in America. C'est important aux Anglais, it's important to the English, so the Canuck does it. Back then, by the way, to say Canuck just meant French-speaking Canadian. And here, Kerouac quite pithily encapsulates both the pressure of assimilation in the US and the wound that lies at the core of his lifelong melancholy, which is to be denied a life in French in the United States, a nation that now, even more than ever, often conflates Anglophone monolingualism with belonging, if not patriotism. For Kerouac, as is the case for many immigrant families to the US, the question of nationality, of belonging and outsiderness is intimately tied to language. And what the Kerouac archive, which is the main part of it is in the New York Public Library's Berg collection, reveals is that even though it was impossible for him to live in French, he secretly found a way to write in French. As he was developing the method he came to call spontaneous prose in the early 1950s, he wrote several French stories, including 2 short novels, without telling anyone what he was up to. In 2016, as Zach said, I released an edition of all the French writings combined, La Vie et Dommage, and then 2 years ago, Gallimard in France released a standalone edition of his longest French novel, Sur le chemin. Now, Sur le chemin does mean on the road, but its most direct translation is On the Path. And it's a different book. It's actually a kind of prequel to On the Road. And in France, it was translated as Sur la route, right? Route and chemin. You can already see a divergence between European French and Québécois French, just in the source of the title. Sur le chemin is a kind of prequel happening when Kerouac's about 10 years old. He wrote it in December 1952. We know this because in the manuscript, the first page, he dates it. You see at the top, December 16th, 1952, sur le chemin, and that's from that notebook. So putting that in the timeline, when I was preparing my edition to Kerouac's French writings, one of the big questions I had was, had he continued writing long-form French texts after 1952? I had found a bunch before that, but not after. I knew that in 1953, he had written two novels, Maggie Cassidy in January and February of 53, and The Subterraneans on October 21st to 23rd, 24th, yes, in 3 days, 1953. Both are central novels in what Kerouac called the Doulouase legend, which is modeled on Marcel Proust's remembrance of things past, kind of the chronicle of his auto-fictional life in literature. So I want to underscore something at this juncture, which is that in Kerouac's career, there's a significant lag between the year of composition and the year of publication for most of his works. He published his first novel in 1950, The Town and the City, under the name John Kerouac. But his second novel, On the Road, was only published in September 1957, even though he had already written it 6 years earlier in April 1951 in the scroll form. Very famous for that. But Kerouac kept writing at a furious pace during what I call the rejection years between 1951 and 56, completing or starting at least 18 books. And here they are listed. But the books he wrote in those years only began going to print after On the Road became a bestseller and a global cultural phenomenon. So those in blue here on the slide are among those he had written during the rejection years. The time lag between composition and publication is even more pronounced if you consider that Kerouac now has more posthumous releases than books published in his own lifetime. He died at the age of 47 in 69. Okay, so that's the wider publishing context. To return to what I was saying, during my years of research hunting down the French manuscripts in the Kerouac archive, I wanted to keep track of the production after 52, if there's any French production. Again, the two novels from 53 are Maggie Cassidy and The Subterraneans. And in his papers, we have two typescripts for The Subterraneans, the original one, and this is the first page of both typescripts, original and the revised one. And evidence suggests that he actually typed it directly first without writing it longhand, which is unusual for Kerouac. But he was testing himself in the 3-day marathon thing too. For Maggie Cassidy, we have the reverse. We have the original manuscript notebooks, but not the full typescript. And it was in scrutinizing these notebooks that I realized Maggie Cassidy was a bilingual manuscript. The Berg includes 4 manuscript notebooks that together make up the first full draft of the novel. This is what they actually look like in terms of size. So you see the fourth one is quite tiny. And he numbers them, Mary 2, Mary 3, in Roman numerals. The bulk of their pages make up the Maggie manuscript, but some pages are notes to other projects, like his ongoing revisions to Dr. Sachs here or On the Road. We also have this amazing catalog of great American types, the pale, hesitant academician from the Midwest, the sexless loudmouth physicist from the Jesuit school. And it goes on for hundreds and hundreds of entries like this. But it's not hard to follow like when the manuscript resumes, because he always puts an indication for himself, like Mary 3, February 4th, Ma's birthday. And yes, that's his mother's birthday. He remembered. So after going through all 4 notebooks and cross-checking with the published novel, I tabulated that 12 of the 47 chapters were originally written in Québécois French. And note that overall, in Kerouac's own arrangement, the chapters of this novel are very uneven. Like you find some that are just 1 paragraph long, and it's the whole chapter. Some are several pages long. The French ones are always on the long side. But what complicates this quantification even further is that when the chapter is in English, or mostly in English, many sentence fragments or phrases are in French. There's an almost constant code switching from French to English, not just from chapter to chapter, but from paragraph to paragraph, and even within single sentences themselves. As a result, I think we can confidently say that Maggie Cassidy's compositional textual condition is bilinguality. So for me, that was quite a major revelation because no scholar or biographer, and there's like over 25 of them, or even Kerouac himself, had ever mentioned the fact that one of the novels he'd published in his own lifetime had originally been bilingual. This also meant that the published Maggie Cassidy was, to a significant degree, an exercise in self-translation. And this allowed me to study Kerouac's translative practices, both to better understand his writing process, but also how this affected the contours of his style, his unique way of kind of unleashing English onto the page. And of course, this became especially important later with my own task as a translator when I set out to translate his 2 French novels into English for the unknown Kerouac. But that's for another talk. Sticking to Maggie Cassidy, the first time the narrative voice switches from English to French comes in chapter 7. And it does so at the precise moment when the narrator, Kerouac's alter ego, French kisses Maggie or Mary in the manuscript for the first time. In the published novel, after the paragraph that ends with "our mouths burn from interchanged spittle, our lips blister, bleed, chap, we were scared," the next paragraph begins, "I lay there on my side with my arm around her neck, my hand gripped on her rib, and I ate her lips and she mine." In the manuscript, we encounter this instead. "We were scared, on se mordait de peine," and then new paragraph, "J'étais couché là sur mon bord avec mon bras dans tout son cou, ma main grippée sur ses seins, puis je mangeais les lèvres et elle les miennes," and so on, in Québécois French. And for the rest of the chapter. In fact, the next 3 chapters, 8, 9, and 10, are in French. So Kerouac sustains the French narrative voice for almost 4 chapters after the kiss. It's difficult to adequately express the range of emotions that I felt when I experiencing this in the reading room when I read the narrative voice suddenly and seamlessly shift into French in the middle of the sentence. The blending of both languages was so seamless, never calling attention to itself. There's no breaks in the pencil strokes. The French voice is simply weaving in and out of English phrases, and the English voice keeps slipping back into French and back again. It was like bearing witness in manuscript form to Kerouac's raw relation to language, that this code switching was in fact not a switch at all, but the code itself, a persistent bilingualism operative in his brain. And I'm just showing you 2 sample pages so you can see how they just look similar. So it was this unbroken flow of a bilingual voice that was striking, that in the midst of composition, the pencil simply moved forward uninterrupted with no visible markers to demarcate one language from the other. In his papers, Kerouac had also preserved a typescript that he referred to as a preamble for Maggie Cassidy, that he intended for it to appear with the book, but it was never published as such. In the preamble, Kerouac announces that this novel is his attempt to explain how I fell in love with a girl and how this girl is the one great love of my life. And he specifies that he has done so in the secret voice that he has learned. I learned how to develop the secret voice, he says. I know how to write down everything that I secretly think. And then he adds mysteriously, but I'll have 2 voices to be able to do this. And this is one of them. Kerouac never goes on to address what the other voice might be. So, but after witnessing the hybrid bilingual nature of the manuscript, I'd like to propose that this is a cryptic admission that of a veiled reference to the secret French voice that was required to write down everything he secretly thinks. This suggests, and indeed all of his French texts suggest, that for Kerouac, there will always be certain things that he recalls and feels and thinks in French, and others that formulate themselves inside of him in English, the latter being the one voice he openly shows to the public. In fact, in Maggie Cassidy, there is one telling moment when Kerouac's father loudly asks him in French, "Tu comprends?" which means, "You get it?" And Kerouac writes that with that one loud French word, his father had made clear to me meanings that can never be recorded in the English language. I underscore this because it's a core part of the larger argument in my book, where I also eventually suggest that the secret voice Kerouac learned to develop might really be bilingualism itself, rather than one language over another, a secretive self-translating generator that occurs in private and becomes a source of stylistic innovation. Okay, so all of that, let's now look at some examples of self-translation. Because I don't have time to show too many, I'm going to tell you right away that in general, Kerouac tends to favor a calque, word-for-word rendition of the French syntax he's used at initial composition. An example of that would be La noirceur du salon becomes the black of the parlor rather than the darkness of the parlor. So through an adherence to the original French syntax, even at the expense of semantics sometimes, Kerouac deliberately chooses to elevate the strangeness of his English. For example, in chapter 8, which is one of the French chapters, the narrator sits waiting in the silence of my mother's house, he says, and hopes that God will reveal to him the outcome of his budding love affair with Maggie. In the French original, he then writes, Il n'y a pas de quoi été, rien, seulement la connaissance que Dieu nous attend, which more or less means nothing happened, nothing, only the knowledge that God waits for us. But in his translation, he imbues the moment with a kind of theological mystery, and he writes, something there was that was not, nothing, just a consciousness that God awaits us. Mm-hmm. The Québécois expression, il n'y a pas de quoi été, does mean nothing happened, but it doesn't need to rely on the word for nothing in French, which is rien. And since rien does appear next in the line, Kerouac finds a way to avoid that repetition by deconstructing the meaning into something there was that was not. Kerouac also decides to translate connaissance with consciousness rather than say knowledge or awareness, more kind of cognates that it might be. But in doing so, he mirrors the structure of the French and the sound of it, which is very important to him in a lot of his translations, to keep the sound. And it also keeps the overall meaning. He also translates Dieu nous attend as God awaits us rather than just God waits for us, which again elevates this kind of spiritual gravitas of the moment. Let me now turn to a wholly different kind of revision that's more about omission than translation. In a manuscript moment from chapter 27, we find a French passage that narrates the words of God, and God speaks in Québécois French. Here, the narrator is alone prior to joining the party that's been given to him for his 17th birthday. And he writes, I should have been happy, but waited for everything profoundly depressed. De les chambres empty, from the empty rooms of my house, God made dark speeches to me. Everybody was off to the party to await my arrival. Si Jean, says God to me, from the rooms where oft I'd prayed on a sudden impulse of dusk, perds pas ton cœur, faut faire sa vie, and so on in French, okay? In the published novel, Kerouac completely expunges this encounter with God and only retains the second sentence in the font here. Everybody was off to the party to await my arrival. I sat alone in the kitchen waiting for Eddie Boy to come. So he's alone instead of being with nothing less than God, right? If I were to translate the absent words of God, the result might be, Tijan, don't lose your heart. We have to make one's life. Settle yourself at my feet and all will be well. The music, the air, I pollute, not peace. Nothing will happen to you that you cannot and could not manage as one can. If it's death, hope that it is short. If it's only hateful troubles or the incomprehensible hatreds of others, count yourself one of my little angels in our universe of sorrow. So God's intervention in the young man's life is a foreshadowing of sorrows to come, but it's chiefly a comforting one. A reminder that he's one of God's little angels and he will help him find peace in life. But Kerouac removes all that for the English version. Note that he also removes what comes just before. I should have been happy, but waited for everything, profoundly depressed. This is a great example of the kind of detail Kerouac will consistently remove when he's revising, which I think there are moments that are too judgmental, too decisive about how a certain moment of life should be explained away or felt. Many times he removes retrospective judgment calls like, we were too young to understand. Or to use another example where he had first written, it was confusing. I had no time to think. Heat generated to the ceiling. In the book, he'll simply revise it to, in the present tense, heat generates to the ceiling, which really puts the reader immersed in the experience itself as it is lived rather than reevaluated in retrospect. So he does that all the time. One of Kerouac's trademark moves then when revising is to omit certain things, to remove certain retrospective judgments. But I also discovered that he sometimes restores things that he crosses out on the manuscript page. All of this stuff that's deleted makes it in the book. You can see that one, the first one, keep at the top, keep. It's like a note to himself. Just amazing to kind of find this in the published novel as you're looking through. So, and all of this I have to explain are these revisions, the three kinds of omission, restoring, translation. All of this happens at the typewriter. In other words, the typewriting phase is simultaneously the moment when he translates and when he revises and rewrites. As his friend John Clellan Holmes puts it, typing to Jack in Jack's career meant rewriting. That's how he rewrote. Now, what my research can add to Holmes's observation is that's also how he translated. For my culminating example, I want to turn to a moment when Kerouac decided not to omit or restore, but rather to add something. At the end of chapter 21, Jack wins a big track race against a star student from Worcester High. And as the narrator looks back at his rival who's leaving the racetrack, he thinks, and him, he'll go back to Worcester, maybe if not to tell, to know that in Lowell, the guys from the alleys and rock streets run like demons. Let the name of Lowell make a noise in their hearts after this. That in the world where the name is Lowell, the boys, brothers, and Matt hurl themselves howling in this mortal ocean. Brothers, boys, wolves of the north. These thoughts were all in French, almost untranslatable. So you have my title here. In the published version, the one we've known since 1959, this is what you get. And so when you read that, it becomes a moment where Kerouac is figuratively reminding his readers via a parenthetical statement that he's translating thoughts that were in French at the time that the narrator experienced them. But the original manuscript exposes the actual translative practice at play in this chapter. This is what it is in French, and you can see at the end of the paragraph that the parenthesis is absent. What we have are the thoughts themselves. Only by reading the French original can we grasp Kerouac's statement is not simply figurative, but rather literal. The sentences are all in French. The added parenthesis becomes a metatextual reflection on the very act of translating that Kerouac is spontaneously experiencing as he's typing, right? And as he struggles to translate this paragraph into English. And the wonky, weird translation I just read is a testament to that untranslatability. Perhaps suggesting as well the furiousness of his translating and typing pace, Kerouac misreads gars fiers, proud boys, as boys' brothers. Fier is, the word for proud, and frère is the word for brother. And they look almost exactly the same, especially on the manuscript there. So the misreading leads him to open an ellipses after ocean, which cuts the flow of the sentence and strands the end of the line with brothers, boys, wolves of the north, and then leads him to feel the untranslatability and address it in a parenthesis. It just flows in the French. What's also crucial to note is that when Maggie Cassidy was published in 1959, 6 years after her initial composition, Kerouac had enough clout to force publishers to release his works as they stood without editorial changes in all their strange and crazy punctuation for glory. If he had wanted to revise his own translations to make them more easily comprehensible, he would have had plenty of time to do so. But Kerouac's ethos of no revisions seems to have extended to his own self-translation. And so in retaining the mistranslation of fier as frère through a process we might call spontaneous translation, he comes to underscore the untranslatability of his own mother tongue thoughts. Adding to this the slew of other translative examples scattered throughout the novel that make English bend to the original French, Kerouac is deliberately following his own edict to refashion English to fit French images, as he says in this letter. All my knowledge rests in my French Canadianness and nowhere else. The English language is a tool lately found, so late. I never spoke English before I was 6 or 7. At 21, I was still somewhat awkward and illiterate sounding in my speech and writings. What a mix-up. The reason I handle English words so easily is because it is not my own language. I refashion it to fit French images. I think we've seen examples of that. All this brings yet another valence as well to Karen Emmerich's argument in a book that I love, that translations are often essentials to, as she says, to the making of originals themselves. There's almost Kerouac's whole career feels like the translation isn't as necessary to the making of originals. Okay, so now let me turn to my conclusion. For this part, I'm going to go a little bit against the traditional grain of this workshop, okay? In this room, I know that we traditionally don't tend to address too much what's happening inside the book, like the characters and the plots, But I'm gonna buck this trend. because I think the plot and the characters and the themes are crucial to Maggie Cassidy's compositional history. As a novel, Maggie Cassidy is a chronicle of a love story, his real life high school romance with an Irish American girl named Mary Carney, who becomes the eponymous Maggie, set in 1939 on the eve of World War II, and then follows his departure from Lowell, Massachusetts for Columbia University on a football scholarship, and ends with his eventual return to Lowell in full disgrace during the war, just before he joins the Merchant Marine. What's particularly striking about the Maggie Cassidy manuscript is that the melding moment of the two languages, as I mentioned earlier, takes place precisely when the French-Canadian boy kisses the Irish-American girl. It is a meeting of two cultures and two languages. It's an intimate moment represented through a return to his most intimate language, from what he called his cradle-warm, protective mind. We have a teenage love story of two young second-generation immigrants who, though living in the small American town, same one, also live in distinct linguistic environments and in different ethnic neighborhoods. This is a map of Lowell, like just before they were born, these two lovers. In a way, the very structure of Maggie Cassidy's original manuscript emphasizes this difference as it dramatizes via the Bildungsroman form even more forcefully what Edouard Glissant calls the micro and macro climates of cultural and linguistic interpenetration. The lovers coming together further reflects a desire for unity that functions on a symbolic, almost patriotic level. Through this love, perhaps the pain of dualism can be healed, fused. If you remember the added phrase at that moment, this is the first French narrative words in the manuscript, on se mordait Penn, and he does not translate it. It's absent from the novel. And it's challenging to translate. It could mean we bit each other of pain, or we bit ourselves out of pain, or even we painfully bit each other. But Kerouac's peculiar original phrasing managed to convey both the sense of an awkward, still untrained kissing technique of a teenager and the carnal need to seek relief through the kiss itself from an inner pain that both young lovers harbor. The passage explicitly states that they are both literally biting and eating each other, consuming each other's flesh. And this process is also happening with the coming together of two languages in Kerouac's brain at this stage in his life. It's born out of love, out of desire, but also out of pain. Kerouac's peculiar use of French in Maggie Cassidy always gives the impression of being affected by its proximity to English. This is visible not only via the preponderance of English terms and phrasings, but also in the fact that many sentences are bilingual, with clauses in English and clauses in French. For instance, take the opening sentence of chapter 8. I see her head bowed and thinking of me par la rivière, ses beaux yeux se cherchant en dedans pour la propre fameuse pensée de moi qu'elle ama. Kerouac later homogenizes the whole into English, though retaining the French syntax. I see her head bowed and thinking of me by the river, her beautiful eyes searching inside for the proper famous thought of me she loved. Or consider this passage from chapter 9, where French is utterly riddled with anglicisms. Ma cloisette tragique, mon jacket, accroché dans un dampness like powder from the fresh plaster lost locked like clay adobe closets, Casbah roof civilizations, les papiers couvris de mes écritures à main imprimées sur le plancher entre bottines, bas, gants, douleurs de passé, sorrows of past. The narrative voice is a kind of franglais, right? From dampness to civilizations, the voice slides from French to English and then turns back to French to describe what was then the early contents of the Kerouac archive. Papers covered with my printed handwritings on the floor among shoes, bats, gloves, sorrows of past. In the manuscript, the parenthesis sorrows of past is a proleptic note to himself about how to translate the last phrase. It's a trick he uses in many of his longer French manuscripts. Once he knows what he's going to translate it as right away, he puts it in a parenthesis. And it's yet another indication that Kerouac's always planning to translate the French when the typing comes. Now, in turning to the novel form and through spontaneous prose to conjure up his 17-year-old self in Maggie Cassidy, the manuscript bears witness to a stage in the evolution of Kerouac's bilingualism. It reflects the degradation of his French, how he can no longer function without Anglicism, outside of diglossia, and the transmogrified birth of his unique relation to English. He can no longer explain himself or describe his life in a single language. His identity is inescapably hybridized and doubled. Dualisms exist in me so that I can confound them, he wrote in 1948. And then they confound me, and it's a confounded mess, and it's in the soul. By 1953, I think it was also on the page. When he was 17, Kerouac was finishing high school. He was entering the Ivy League. He was fully immersed in a greater and greater desire, and in fact, a need to master English, a reality that is now reflected at the sentence level in the manuscript. And so, on a personal level, at this stage of his identitarian development, English is winning. And so, appropriately, there's more English, quantitatively speaking, in the manuscript than there is French, just like in his life. Pushing this to the next level, then, the manuscript reflects the linguistic reality of the Franco-American community at the time. The bastions of survival that had kept the French-Canadian language and culture distinct have by now, on the eve of World War II, begun to crumble, especially through the laws forbidding French education in schools in America. Kerouac is the living embodiment of this acculturation and assimilation. And yet his relation to this paradigm shift is complex, even as he's being swept away into a love affair with both the English language and with Maggie Cassidy, who herself represents this difference and its allure. He also inherits the pressure to maintain his ethnic and linguistic heritage. His protagonist's personal trajectory mirrors that of the greater French-Canadian diaspora on the continent. The Franco-American community was running headlong into English, a reality that is painfully and yet poetically reflected at the sentence level of the Maggie manuscript, constantly moving between languages, overlapping, tumbling over one another, jockeying for space, giving us an unprecedented glimpse into the operations of a mother tongue under siege and the unpredictable rise of an as yet unconverted bilinguality. On the one hand, the Maggie Cassidy manuscript is a sobering textual testimony of the assimilation, acculturation, diglossia, the first language attrition that turned Kerouac into a walking ghost, forever doubled, as were generations of Franco-Americans in these waning years of survivance. But at the same time, it showcases Kerouac's tremendous resilient linguistic genius in turning such a tragic continental loss into literary innovation. Here again, we see how spontaneous prose evolved directly in response to Franco-America's ethno-linguistic situation, that French-Canadian way of using English, as he puts it in Book of Dreams, and perhaps even became a poetic means of expressing, as he says in the novel, les douleurs des passés, the sorrows of the past. Thank you very much.
Stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Okay, the floor is open, as is the Zoom, for questions. Yeah.
So one really little question and then a little bigger question. Where does the K come from in his last name? Is the little
The first letter?
yeah.
Well, I know that in Quebec, it's mostly spelled Kirouac,
Okay.
Kerouac. He traces it back to Breton, Kerouac, which means a bunch of different things. But he went on all sorts of different kinds of genealogical searches. Some are proven untrue, but he clings to a lot of the myths. But I know that his father's birth certificate has an I on it. Leo Alcide Kerouac, and most of the folks who have that last name in Quebec will have an I.
Okay. So the real question is, was Maggie Cassidy translated into French in his lifetime, and was it Parisian?
Not in his lifetime, and all the translations of Kerouac are, and this is a sore spot for me, Parisian, in the sense that they don't get it, you know? It's the wrong idiom, it's the wrong references, it's the wrong continent. And it's like translating Black vernacular, you know, in Europe somewhere. It just doesn't make sense. And so there's a lot missing, and he's regarded as a big, you know, that's why the title of the book is Big American Writer, you know? Yes, that's something that Quebec poets and writers have tried to fight against for many years, and there are some rogue translations out there. And there is one in the works that I think might happen, which is about Visions of Gerard. That's going to be done in Quebecois French. But José Camun, who translated the scroll version of On the Road in 2010, so that came out in 2008, but the French Gallimard in 2010. When she discovered that my edition of the French writing, she said, if I had known, I would have done it completely differently. So, yeah.
JC, I just want to thank you for a really exciting talk. I think it really helps open up new avenues when we think about the beat language, because what struck me about some of the examples that you were giving was that the Quebecois French was not a sort of high French, right? It's the way he speaks to his father, you got it, right? It's a really like street kind of way of speaking that the beats are always trying to find in English. So I'm wondering if this can actually help open us up when we think about beat language, that it's always a kind of, as you mentioned, like white people always trying to translate down to the real. And I think you see it clearly here with Kerouac, but we also see it, I mean, we've talked about this before in this field, but the real with the Black vernacular. I'm wondering if that sort of secret language is really him saying like, here's the difference between the real French that I'm trying to get to the real English that I'm trying to get to the beat language. It also struck me that like a lot of those flowery languages, those flowery sentences were really kind of like 19th century construction, right? So I'm wondering what you think about that, how it can kind of open us up to thinking about the beat language.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, one thing is that a lot of the main figures of the beats are actually often quite bicultural. Ginsberg, Jewish, Yiddish, Corso, Italian American. They have this other kind of upbringing that's elided in many ways, and they can navigate multiple languages in that way. One particular thing with Kerouac is that he did, and a lot of the beats are about that, trying to capture kind of making the literary a way of feeling the experience of the emotion of the life, kind of like why he removes certain details so that you're immersed in it. And his French only existed as speech in his lifetime. So in Quebec, it takes Michel Tremblay's play Les Belles Sœurs in 1968 for Quebecois French to become an official literary language. Before that, it's too looked down upon, the lowest of the low kind of it doesn't have a scripturality, to use Glissant's word, right? So he's trying to give a scripturality to what is only an orality, which leads to a bunch of floating weird spellings. But he reads French in French, and he actually, one of his favorite authors is Rabelais, that he reads in middle, and that's what he has often uses a Z, a Z. I don't know. Z.
In American.
Yeah, at the end of ER verbs in his manuscripts. So he's all over the map in that way, but he's also kind of hearkening back to the evolution of French, its own scripturality that was not always just set in stone. What's super amazing for me when I was studying the stuff is he ends up creating a scriptural way of writing down what becomes Haitian Creole sometimes. You have to, Haitian Creole wasn't official, as solidified into a grammar and an orthography yet either. But so for the word for cheval in Creole is CHWAL, and that's all over his manuscripts also. And sometimes he uses SHWAL, which I find a very American way of writing cheval with an SH. So he's actually creating these continental kind of hemispheric links with other colonies, other peoples whose street language and life language is beneath the official language of literature and of education, but then finds their way later to have enough clout to become regarded as potentially literary. He doesn't have that yet. That's why he's always thinking of translating it immediately. There's just no publishing outlet but he's like, it's painful because he's like 5 years away from seeing his mother tongue become an actual potential literary language. I always get sad for him thinking about that, but I think there's a lot to it there in terms of like the whole beat that's part of his beat ethos that he can kind of or what we associate with a beat ethos of like capturing the vividness of a certain kind of life, because he's not even trying when he makes a real effort to write proper French, he can do it. Like when Louis Ferdinand Céline died, Céline was like his favorite writer, and him and Proust, he wrote a letter in French to be published in France, and that one is written correctly, you know. But when he's doing it for his literary purposes, he's not after that. He's after the raw experience of how he thought it, how he lived it, and so it was using that language. And I think the beats are often trying to get back to that immediacy in that way.
Just kind of, oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead, then we'll go up to Annie.
Okay, this is just maybe to follow up on the question a bit or your answer to it, because like the hemispheric thing is very interesting, right? And these different languages he's connecting to, but I guess I was wondering about the sort of seeing him as French Canadian and then exilic or immigrant, because it seemed like you're also situating him in Lowell really specifically in this as a kind of in a kind of multi-ethnic working class kind of geography or whatever, right? So I guess, you know, I have a sort of general question about the sort of linguistic difference between like French Canadian as spoken in Quebec and then as potentially, you know, as maybe spoken in Lowell, but also what about that frame on him as a kind of part of this sort of multi-ethnic American working class city? Like, is that, how does that play into it?
Oh yeah, I mean it's his core identity, you know. I mean the reason he gets to go to Columbia is because he's like a lot of working class kids. This is his only shot at a higher education. It's because he's a good athlete, so he gets a football scholarship. But otherwise, he'd be doomed, you know, to work in the mills. And he writes about that in his first French novel, about his horror, his fear of being forced to work in the mills like everybody else in the family. There's a great sequence where he asks a friend who he's new in the mill because he did work on it, and he's like, "How long you been working in the mills?" He's like, "About 3 months." "What'd you do before that?" "What you think? I was working in the mills." like that's all there is. Like it's just another mill, you know. And he's like, "I gotta get out of here." You know? But it's very much that identity, and the other factor about it, Lowell and Fall River and a lot of the other kind of New England towns, is there were big bastions of what was called survivance, which is like a mix of, you know, survival and resistance melded together. And they had their own French newspapers, his father included. He was a printer, which I think affected his love of print. And then the churches and the schools. He really started to be forced to learn English once he moved to a different district, and he had to go to English parochial school for the first time, and that really started a different path. And his whole family was part of they were called survivants prononcés, like very active survivalists, or in that community. So you know, the church, the newspapers, the schools. If you have the three, you can kind of maintain the language, the culture, and it's kind of hermetic. They were also, but they were also kind of not appreciated necessarily. Maggie Cassidy, what's great is that it's a real conflict between the Irish and the French Canadians. And there's a party scene where it starts to go bad between the two groups. And the father's like, "Hey, let's talk English now, okay?" You know, like he's like trying to calm things down. And the fact that he's going over the fence kind of to be with Mary Carney is, you know, the family doesn't like that. And so back then it was referred to as a mixed race marriage. It just was. So even in Canada, if you were from Quebec and you marry an Ontarian, no, you know, that's a mixed race thing. It was very ethnicized, like, and French Canadians were kind of the lowest of the low. They were in contemporary newspapers, they were referred to as the Chinese of the Eastern States, the white N-words, you know, dumb Canucks, all of that. You would just hear that all the time. So he's very much ethnicized and racialized. And it brings a different way of reading how he falls for bebop and jazz and wants to hang out in other kind of minority kind of subcultures as he gets to New York and wants to experience that. It's just that he presents as Anglo-Saxon or something, but he's not, and he always had a hard time kind of explaining that. And Ginsberg, when he was invited to the La Rencontre Internationale Jack Kerouac to Quebec City in 1987, which was like a big deal in Quebec, it was all around Kerouac. He said, like, you know, he was always trying to talk to us about French Canadian stuff, and none of us could understand what the hell he was talking about. You know? Like he could never communicate it, but secretly he did in his archive. You know, but I don't know if that answers.
Peter or Annie? I don't know which of you has a question.
I just think this was brilliant. I mean, there were just so many things to think about, and it was so exciting. So I just got this really perverse thought. What if you, as somebody who obviously knows a lot of classical French as well as, I mean, you really understand the Quebecois. What if you were employed to translate the manuscripts word for word into regular French? I'm not suggesting you do. I just wonder what you'd think about it.
No, it's something I have thought about. I've translated the 2 French novels into English, and but when it comes to translating it into standard French, it's tricky because in a way I feel it would expunge some of the magic of what happens, in part because of bilingualism and the collapse of the 2 languages. So at some point in French, he says like, si j'aime pas la job, je quitte, you know? And it's like, he's saying, if I don't like the job, I quit, but he's also saying, I depart, je quitte, you know, quitter. And there's tons of, and that's part of what I called my edition of his French writings, La vie est dommage, D' is that it's a pun, because it means both life is an homage to something, but when you just say it out loud, it's la vie est dommage, it means life is painful, life is, you know, and it's riddled with that. It's so poetic, his way of using his way of inventing the scripturality, you know? And so it would be a tricky thing. I think it would be interesting for European translators to look at it and to consider how it might affect the idiom, you know, of how they use certain kinds of terms. But to me, it's like, it's too beautiful the way it is. I don't know how, you know, it's my own mother tongue as well. So it would be like, it would be a kind of a bowing down to the colonizer again.
That's sort of what I thought you might say.
I wanted to ask you a question about I love how you present the typewriter as, you know, the engine of translation.
Right.
I mean, we had known about him revising the typewriter, we're not translating. I guess I wanted to know more about that, because he's clearly someone who's using manuscript as a kind of almost automatic writing technique, right? And the way he's switching English and French, it seems like part of that process is manuscript, right? Like it's the instant flow of his thoughts from one language to the other that it feels to me, right, that the typewriter does not do that in a way. Like so I guess I'm wondering about that sense of like, there's the bilingualism you're talking about. There's also the kind of material textualism, right? And like he seems to think of these 2 modes in 2 different ways. And it also made me wonder, like, what's going on with him and the type, like, where did he learn to type? Like, we don't think of the 1950s as a period where tons of men know how to type or are typing, right? I mean, it's usually, you think in an office environment, they're dictating to women who are typing. So,
well, the beasts knew how to type.
You know, where were they learning typing, and is it for him a kind of part of this? Is it part of his kind of like the flow of writing, or is it a different experience for him than manuscript writing?
It's definitely one of his big prosthetics for sure for his composition because there's a great book called The Typewriter is Holy because it's a line from Howl by Ginsberg. Everything is holy, 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 right? But the typewriter is one of the things that's holy, and it definitely is for those dudes. And I'm not sure when he learned exactly. That's a good question, but he's famous for being a fast and a loud typist. Like you could hear him from room, going super fast. And he was also famous for typing the works of his buddies. So he did that for William Burroughs in Tangiers, typing up Naked Lunch. He gave the title Naked Lunch. He did that to a ton of other what he then called Burroughs called the word horde, all over the place. And he did write synopses of films for 20th Century Fox. He had to type them out really fast and send them off. So he worked at it. He was paid to do it as well. But he also wanted to kind of, Subterranean is an example of that, kind of wanting to test himself to just do that spontaneous prose without any judgment, to get into that trance-like, what do you call it, trance-like discipline of just not even having any censoring forces inside his brain, especially about shame or anything, going into the flow. And of course, famously, he taped up together those 6 pieces of Japanese paper to type up on the road as a way not to have to stop the flow of his thought and then recrank something. Excuse me, that whole kind of like stopping everything like that, so he could just go. And he's like, I wrote it on the scroll. The road is fast, and I wrote fast. It's like, so the book, like the manuscript, looks like the theme of the book. So he has these 2 modes definitely, but there's also examples, I should say, of him translating in notebooks, especially for Sur le Chemin, the longest French novel. I found this handwritten. I recognized that this was the opening to that novel. And it was amazing because he had like 6 different adjectives for this Quebecois word that I was like, how would you translate that? And there he was like, he also didn't know. He had like 6 different options for it. And they were all neologisms, like be hassled, fold or roll some, just like words that don't exist. And he's just kind of imposing them there. So, but for him, it was like the consolidation of the tale as well. So if he has like a notebook from here, a notebook from there, they're all in bundles, but he then takes this moment and he shoves it in here. So a bunch of On the Road is actually diary entries, almost word for word, that he stitches together from when he's at the typewriter. So it's really a way to consolidate the narrative, and when he's ready to do that. But he'll try some. But the other thing too is that he seems to not want anyone to know about the French past of any of these manuscripts. And so the publishers only, and we know that he was already shopping Maggie Cassidy in 1953, because there's letters with Ginsberg and stuff where he was acting as his agent at the time, saying, I showed it to Win, he doesn't want it, whatever. And so he's already translated it. And that's part of my point, is that he does it so fast and then he doesn't revise that.
Yeah, Tina, and then we'll come over here.
That was so interesting. I guess my question is about what a sort of thought experiment, like, it seems maybe because of the context in which you've been talking about this here, you're being very generous towards the sort of, to us, giving us all these these details about Kerouac's specificity, and he's sort of appearing in your narrative as this exceptional character. But in some ways, I feel like what you've done in this talk is sort of expose something that's much more the general condition of language for most people in the world, which is to say, I mean, most people inhabit language as something that they have an outside of because they have another language. And we forget that. And your talk is a sort of reminder of that. So what would happen if you were to talk about him as the norm rather than the exception?
Well, part of what I tried to gesture in the conclusion is that he is representative of an entire community, the Franco-American community, at that moment in time, as it's losing its ability to continue to be educated and find, have their own spirituality and their newspapers in the language that they prefer using.
And that would apply to many of those communities. as
Yeah,
well.
and it would, it's just that community, but and that's why I tried to gesture as well that most second generation immigrants have this really conflicted relation, like the language in the home, how it's spoken at the kitchen table, the food, all of that stuff, right? And then the outside stuff, like in the American streets, there's like multiple layers of languages, 3, 4, 5 kinds of languages, in the classroom and in the alleyways, in the streets, at home. And so, yes, it's a kind of a very American kind of experience, that he could be kind of seen in that, having experienced that. I think in criticism, he's been not allowed to have that kind of an experience in many ways, because he's just kind of pigeonholed as one, as Jack Kerouac, that one thing. But yeah, of course, I think what's unique about him though is that not everybody in their own kind of solitude goes in a private room and tries to invent a scripturality for their inner language in that particular, that without rules, without I think that's a beautiful thing and a unique thing, but it's also something that, and I think he was after that in his purpose as a writer, is that if he can communicate that, then people will obtain what he called telepathic shock and meaning excitement, meaning I've communicated, we have the telepathy now. And I think that from beyond the grave, that was his great hope. And I think he's reached, generations of readers that way, that from all around the world, in translation and in English, and that he's given someone a telepathic shock in that way. And he certainly doesn't need us academics to validate that. He's one of those writers that finds his readers without the help of stuff he professes.
Lynn.
This has been wonderful and fascinating, and as somebody who has a lot of French Canadians in me and grew up in Maine where
Right.
there were communities
For
and
sure.
experienced a lot of this even in my French teacher in high school. But it's really fascinating to think about that. I was wondering about, they were showing where he had crossed out things in the notebooks.
Right.
And it's like he's doing a first level revision as he goes through and decides this and this. I mean, because when you're talking about going to the typewriter, but he's already, am I correct? It's already some kind of revising at that stage before he actually does whatever translation of the text he's doing at the typewriter.
Yes, I think he's hard to pin down, because a lot of what he's said is like no revisions.
Yeah.
Like that's the myth. But then you open up his notebooks and you're like, come on, man.
Yeah.
He was his own worst PR guy in that way, right? Because then people just thought he had no craft and he wasn't trying hard. It was just whatever kind of fell onto the page. And I think in 1953, so in 1952, he writes Dr. Sachs, Sur le chemin, Visions of Cody, revises On the Road a lot. He's really at the top of his game. He's like, he knows what spontaneous prose is supposed to do. And I think those restorations are evidence of him doubling down on what it means to commit to spontaneous prose after a kind of initial revision. Like you say, he goes over and then he's like, no, keep. And then to see them all restored in the published book is I've found no letter or anything where he's explaining that process, but I'm just kind of speculating that it's a commitment to, I'm going to just go with what first came to me and I'm going to give that to the world, And the weird thing is that a lot of that was in French, so he had still had to translate. Spontaneous is mediated by translation in that way. But yeah, he has these phases where he goes like that. And then later on, he really stopped revising too, but he also had some diminishing returns because he was a full-blown alcoholic by then. But that's a whole different story. But yeah, he has those phases.
Thanks, JC. That was great.
Thanks.
So a two-part question, maybe related. I'm not sure. One's more concrete than the other. The first one, I guess, has to do with your use of the term code switching.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself sort of thinking about quite a bit. It seems sort of like necessarily performative, right? Like you code switch for an audience. So I guess I'm sort of seeking clarity on sort of your use of the term. Is this a private place where he is sort of contending with code switching in his public life? Or are you suggesting that this is sort of an example of code switching in and of itself? And just maybe sort of you could talk a little bit more about kind of your use of that term. And then the second part is maybe just sort of more obvious, which is he clearly didn't like to be edited or want to be edited, but did he have an editor? Was there a relationship over time with an editor where and was this invisible to the editor of like no concept, because he or she was only receiving a typescript?
Yeah. Okay. So code switching, I think you're right that it's not a term that applies to how he would have thought of what he's doing. As I'm switching codes here. I think that's kind of what I'm using the term largely because that's how it's used in public discourse, especially like in places like Quebec, code switching is always like it's how people discuss, bonjour, hi, or whatever, that kind of immediate switch. If growing up there, you'll just going to any high school, people will be code switching all the time. Like it just happens in the middle of the sentence and we don't even notice it sometimes, it's like a thing like that. And I only learned of that term much later, like not when I was living it as a high schooler myself, say. So I guess but yes, I do think that's more of a public kind of facing term in that way. In terms of an editor, so he fought really hard to keep the thing as is. He didn't have that power with On the Road. In fact, but the legend is that he came into Giroud's office with like the scroll, and he was like, "No one will touch a word of this," it was like a roll of a paper towel. He described it as, and he like unfurled it or something. And he was like, "Well, Jack, I'm gonna have to like put it in sheets." And he's like, "No," and he ran away or something. But then we're talking about 5 years of attrition and rejection, and he got buckled down into revising a lot. But there's a book that came out, or that's going to come out. There was an article, like an excerpt from it, that came out recently about Malcolm Cowley's work at Viking. And Cowley was an internal defender and celebrator of Kerouac when no one else was. Him and Ginsberg. And he has a great line. He's like, Jack Kerouac is the greatest unpublished writer in America. And he believed it On the Road. But part of what happened at Viking is they did a ton of punctuation changes without telling him. And he was enraged when it came out. But then his life, changed so drastically after that. It was, he couldn't handle the fame and everything. It's almost like, the rejection is when he was his most productive and his most innovative. In fact, On the Road is very tepid in terms of, innovations that he made in Dr. Sachs and Maggie Cassidy. Maggie Cassidy is great. The novel ends where the narration becomes a third person narrator suddenly, and he's only referred to as the garage man. And because he gets kicked out of school, he comes back to Lowell, and all he does is he parks cars, and he can't even consolidate an I anymore. He's just the garage man, and stylistically it works great. My students are always fearful of it. I'm always like, is this what's going to happen to you at the Ivy League? Is this what's going to happen to you? You're going to go back home as a garage man? Oh God. But in terms of an editor, yeah, he ended up with the bestseller. He ended up having enough power to say no. And when they tried to do the same thing to him with Dharma Bombs, he made a bunch of changes on the galleys to restore the stuff, but they made him pay. They made him pay out of his pocket for the galley revisions. And then after that, he had put in his contracts a clause saying you can't touch any of this stuff.
Thank you for great talk and a great delivery. I also find accounts of Douglas and bilingual is extremely moving, so this was I will with
the consent of the host. I will move away from materiality for a second. And I was very intrigued by the two references you made to metatextual elements in both. The first, very clear, explicit metatextual consideration of the narrator, and then more exciting for me, the level in which the plot itself comments on, if not on the narration proper, on the linguistic form of the narration. And I was wondering if you could say more on this, if you have found other such elements when explicit metatextual expressions are accompanied by less explicit, more implicit, metaphorical, and prone to interpretation references. I'm always very intrigued. So
well, I hope I'm answering the question here, but I'll say this. Part of why I was amazed at the fact that this text is so fundamentally bilingual, but also more English than French in terms of its quantity, is that he wrote it within weeks of his longest French novel, Sur le Chemin. And that one is almost all completely in French, with only a few inserts. It's complicated to get into it, that are in English. And he's chronicling when he was 10 years old in that. And then he's 17 in this one. And that's when I kind of had the epiphany, he was losing his French at 17. He was way more into English, and he was falling in love with the language and with this girl and with the culture. And he had to study English now suddenly. But when he was 10, he hardly knew any English. And the textual condition of that manuscript mirrors that as well. And it's not like he suddenly lost his capacity to write French in 3 weeks, right? From December 1952 to January, February of 53. So it's a conscious choice to, at that moment in my life, that I was the French kid or the French Canadian kid. And here I was this teenager really struggling and diglossic and losing it, you know? So to me, that's part of how I meant this kind of metatextual reflection on the large, and then of course, what that means for his heritage as a community and what happened to the millions of French Canadians after they came into this country. And now it's mostly just surnames and cemeteries and not an active, thriving language and community. Not as much, you know. I mean, I'm still in touch with like people in Maine, the Franco-American Center at Maine and everything, but they lost their NEH grant too. So all of these communities are under threat, you know, and the French language in the US is just not, nobody cares. You know?
But I want to get to the comments, but just picking up on that. Yeah. It feels almost like there's something a little in tension with the way you're presenting that, where, you know, he's making conscious or semi-conscious choices about writing, you know, in French, in English, and he's engaged in a kind of Joycean, you know, punning mixture.
Oh, it's very funny as well. Yeah,
right?
very, yeah.
And then the way you're talking, but then the idea that you also articulated that, you know, he kind of hides the French, right? He doesn't want people to know, you said, that he's writing these in French or partially in French.
Yeah.
And so then the publication aspect is there's a kind of shame or, you know, minoritized identity where he so I just wonder, it's like, is there any other way to read his decision to turn them all into basically monolingual English texts? Like, there's something, maybe, I don't know, I was thinking like, you know, he's creating this weird melange of two languages. Then he's defamiliarizing it even more. Like he has that line where he says like, I write English so well because it's not my language, you know? So then like the publication in English, it's almost like he's taken the ladder out from under after he's climbed up, you know, like, and he's just left us with the kind of superstructure of this language that's weird, and it creates the beat language, right? I mean, it's part of like his language. I don't know. I just wonder if like there's a different way to read because you also, what made me think is you also said like part of what he's trying to do with the spontaneous prose is like to remove any shame.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
like to
yes.
to fully commit to like and taking out the judgmental phrases, and then like so is he putting that back in by then translating everything into English, or is he doing something else?
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways of answering that. One is that no question, if you land upon different moments in his life, he can feel an intense shame, and he'll have stories where he narrates French Canadian characters around him. The narrator never reveals that he's one of them, and just explains how terrible they are. And they're just so crude, and they sound idiotic, and they can't talk well. It's just the shame of the immigrant child, you know, in that new country. And so there's definitely moments of shame for sure. I think that's part of why he was drawn to invent the method where he, in his you know, techniques for spontaneous prose, he's got all these amazing bullet points, you know, be in love with your life, you're a genius all the time. And those are, he's not saying I'm a genius. He's saying if you want to write with no shame, you have to be in the mindset where you feel you're a genius all the time. So you'll be, you know, the full confidence for everything. But one of them is no shame in the dignity of your language. And it's like, when I read that, I'm like, well, you had some because but again, look at the way he translates. He leaves a trace of himself for sure. It's like unquestionably altered by the movement. He doesn't accommodate English in that way. He makes English bend to the syntax that came before. And that's, I think, his way of doing it. But the other thing to think about too is he only mentions twice that he's written in French. And one is in that same letter where he says, it's not my own language, like Beckett, you know, like Beckett, I wrote in French because it's not my own language. Him, it's the reverse. So he says, one day I'll write a novel in French, and it'll be the most rudimentary French. And then in 1953, on January 10th, right after finishing the longest French novel, while he's writing Maggie Cassidy, he says to his friend Neil Cassidy, I just wrote a novel in French in 5 days. It's about you and me when we were kids, and I'm going to send it to you, and you're going to laugh as soon as I finish translating and typing. Translating and typing. And so there is no outside sending it to the world or anyone else without translation. But also even in Quebec, you couldn't get published. The first Joël novel is 1964, Le Cassé, and the hero's name of that novel is Tijan, and Tijan is Jack Kerouac's nickname from childhood. So it's all like, you know, it took so long for them to actually have it's kind of like Haitian Creole. When was that first novel? When did they allow for that to be a national literature? You know, so the shame is definitely there. But he wanted to be a public writer. He wanted to get published, so you got to translate.
So there was actually a question, not exactly in the chat, but from Mitch, who texted me, so very before he left. And it is, Mitch points out that the French keyboard is different, French typewriter keyboard is different than the QWERTY. And what are the implications of that?
You just switch the button on.
Could Kerouac type in Quebecois? Is how Mitch put it in his text, but yeah.
Well, it wouldn't. It didn't
Yes.
exist then. Like you know, there was no agreed upon standardized orthography for Quebecois French in his lifetime.
Yeah.
So I guess.
So, but he is. I mean, at its most basic
French, standard French.
Right,
You
he's
know,
the
like
same
people
letters.
learn- Yeah, but
I
if
mean,
you learn
but
to
he.
type
Well,
on
I'll tell you this: he adds the accents by hand on lead pencil in the.
Oh, so he's not using a French
No, he's
typewriter.
using an. Yeah, he adds them by hand, and then a lot of publishers forgot that he did that, and because there's a great bilingual poem called "On Waking from a Dream" of Robert Fournier in Poems All Sizes. That he wrote it in 1955, but it got published by Ferlinghetti later. First in 1977 in the City Lights Journal, but then in 1992 for Poems, Poems, the phonetic poems, all sizes, and it's bilingual. So en face edition, like French on the left, and they didn't put the accents on it, but if you go look at the typescript, they're there. Yeah.
Oh,
And then there's another question.
Peter Anning.
Is this from you, Peter? Because then you get to ask it, but two in a row.
Thank you, JC. That was absolutely dazzling. It really was just sensational.
Thank you.
I wanted to come back to Zach's earlier question and try and put together, if it's possible, I don't know, it may be too complicated, but the speed of thought, speed of writing, and bilingualism. So what I'm thinking about here is that I'm presuming that Kerouac can type far faster than he can write. I mean, looking at that writing, he's writing in 2 columns, really strangely. As he writes, it looks pretty slow. And it's pretty clear too that the writing is relatively anyway. It looked pretty clear to me. But I'm thinking if a speed typist, I actually don't know very much about this, but I presume that a fast typist types far faster than they can write.
Yes.
And so if that's the case, then I'm interested in the bilingualism, and how, I'm thinking of the opposite case, which is Kafka. One of the first letters he ever wrote on a typewriter, he writes at his office. It's a love letter, and he calls it a 3-flag letter. And the 3-flag, a 3-color flag, a 3-color flag letter. The sort of 3 colors. He starts really slowly on a typewriter at the office. So it's a love letter, but it's mainly XXXX. He crosses out all the time. So it must have taken ages to write. Then he gets on a bus and carries on in graphite on the bus. And so that's slow because it's wobbly, and and finally he gets home and he finishes it off in ink, which is the fastest part he's writing. So the first thing to say is that a technology can speed you up or slow you down. In other words, the same technology is radically slowing Kafka down, whereas I presume it's radically speeding. It's like speed. It's like writing on speed, And so the notion of writing continuously, the scroll. And I'm wondering if there's something connected with bilingualism there. Is that, I mean, Kafka's in the same situation. He, could have written in Czech, he could have written in Yiddish. He has to write in German. There's no, there is no alternative really.
Right.
If he wants to get published, so he writes in German, but he constantly thinks, and he makes all these bilingual puns between German and Czech. Like Kafka itself, it means crow in Czech. So he makes these puns on his own name. And so I'm just thinking, is there any way of weaving these things together coming back to the speed of thought, because it's one of the things we don't normally think about, is that particularly in material culture, we don't think about it because, we tend to resist that in the notion of the speed of thought. But Kerouac makes that point. If he's thinking in French, how fast can you think in French and translate? How fast can you then get it down if you're thinking in 2 languages simultaneously and and I'm just wondering whether you ever think about the technology which he can do slowly in writing, I'm presumably relatively slowly in writing, but really fast when he gets to typing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I wish we had footage of him typing, or writing. I know that the notebook is definitely, he could not, go anywhere without a bunch of notebooks in his, especially if they could fit in his breast pocket. Often he also liked stenographers' notebooks, which have that line, and he would often write in columns in that way. And it's funny that the first page is English on one side and French on the other, but it's not a real dichotomy. He writes on both columns in one, but he wrote fast. There are some notebooks that are almost, I can't read them. I can't decipher them. And when I was deciphering the longest French one, Sur le chemin, I got to some parts where I was really struggling, and I think it's because of how fast he's writing it in with his pencil as well. Not as fast as typing, but still very, very fast. And in fact, the extant pages of typescript translation of that novel that he had left often became what I needed to realize what word it was he was translating. So another example of needing the translation to make the original is that So there's that clarity that comes with the typing, but there's no question that he was seeking to use the typewriter in part for speed, and then with dexedrine and speed itself. Although it's a myth that he wrote on the road on speed, he wrote it on coffee. And in fact, there's a great letter where he writes coffee in capital letters 3 times, coffee, coffee, coffee. Like, so he took a lot of coffee. But so in those 3 weeks that he typed on the road, in 3 weeks, he did it at the typewriter, and he found a way to use the scroll to make that speed happen. And then the Subterraneans is his next attempt to, like I said, we can't really find any manuscript pages of the Subterraneans, and he wrote it in 3 days, October 21 to 24th. And I think he could only have done that at the typewriter that fast. And apparently there's, based on letters and testimony by Burroughs and Ginsberg, is he was like a ghost after he was extremely pale and skinny and falling down after those 3 days. He had not slept or eaten. He had just typed that whole time.
Is there another comment?
For me, no, nothing else in the chat, but so great. I'm just gonna thank you for all this. One thing, it's just a sort of a lame thought. I feel like you could say even more about this interesting word Penn and also mandat de Penn. There's a weird echo of Roget's last material text seminar spring, because he was talking about this author, 18th century author Graffini, whose works are anonymously published, and the phrase on the title page is a pen, like at a place or with difficulty.
Barely.
It can mean all those things. And I was like, yeah, that sort of difficultiness of pen is, well, as well as the barreliness. I mean, it's like, because it almost sounds like it's like they're not fighting each other. It's like the pen and not pen. I'm not sure how I understand those things. A lot of things I don't understand at all. But so that's one thing. I'll just throw out the other quickly, is that I feel like, and especially in your response to Heather, I feel like the story got a little more complicated about the move away from French, the sort of immigrant, the shame cult, all the stuff we've just been talking about, because I didn't know anything about this survivant, this sort of language recovery within a certain linguistic community and printing of newspapers. It makes sense just to know about this particular case. So is there anything to say about his own reception within his own community? I mean, obviously he's gone off the deep end for them, I can imagine, but there is some sense of the opposite of shame within this culture, right? Of like, embrace it, publish it, and hang on to it. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a very complex. The last chapter of my book is all about that, his reception in Quebec.
Or even in Lowell.
In Lowell too, but in Lowell, yeah, it's like a love-hate with Kerouac.
Yeah.
But everybody wants that, as John Sampas used to say, the literary executor. He's everybody wants a piece of Jack. Everybody. And the French, the Americans, the Quebecois, the Bretons, everybody wants a piece of the guy, and they all claim him as his own. In Quebec, what's amazing is that in 1967, he went on TV, in Radio-Canada, like this French CBC, and did an interview in French. It's an amazing document to watch, because you hear him speak his Lowell Franco-American next to this. And he's just like, in jeans with his rolled up sleeves, like this. And they put them on this terrible little couch that forces them to be like right next to each other like this. And the other guy is wearing a 4-piece suit, and he's speaking the French, because back then it was too shameful to speak the street French. And he refuses to go down to that level, whereas Kerouac's like, he tries to ask him this question like, qu'est-ce que Jean-Louis Kerouac pense de Jack Kerouac? Like, what does Jean-Louis Kerouac think of Jack? And he's like, qu'est-ce que tu dis là? He's like, what do you say? And then he said, and instead of going to meeting him on the language that Fernand Séguin, the host, clearly knew, also any Quebecois kid would know, he translates it into English. He won't even go publicly into the the Joie, and he says, "What does John Kerouac think? What do you think of yourself?" He asks, you know. And he's like, "Qu'est-ce que je pense de moi-même? Je suis tanné de moi-même." I said, "I'm fed up with myself," is what Kerouac says. But there's this real clash. And at the time, people were so ashamed. They were ashamed of what Kerouac had done because he was showing the Quebecois people, like, this is what you really are. You're not this host who's pretending to be Parisian and you know, the parler bien, c'est se respecter, you know, to speak well is to respect yourself, that whole thing. And he was showing them the skeleton in the closet, kind of. And at the time, he was a disaster. And they laughed at him in the audience. He was saying, like, the way he was talking made the audience laugh. And there's a moment where he says, like, what are they laughing at me for? You know, and he's like, "Oh, they're laughing with you. They're laughing with you." Try to calm him down. But then the year after that, Michel Tremblay's play comes out, Les Belles Sœurs, which, you know, then it opened in France. It changed the whole landscape. And then he got there's an anthropologist, Jean Morancy, who calls it the invention of Kerouac in Quebec. He got reinvented, reused as an example of, we can make it big. We are continental. We're not small, we're big. And even the Quebec government, there's documents, it's amazing, where they say, we must urgently recuperate Kerouac. You know, it's like, when has any nation like urgently needed a novelist, you know, about anything? That's what I was like, what the hell? You know, but the language of urgency was amazing. And it's like, it's urgent for our national cause and our language and our pride in what we can be, that we need this guy because he's known around the world. He shows that we're not like a little people. There's an expression in Quebec called born for a little bread, you know, né pour un petit pain. And that's what he was bucking against, that he's like a continental figure. So it's an amazing whole kind of reinvention of him and needing him to be. And there's some writers that claimed him violently. Like when Ferlin-Getty and Ginsberg went to Quebec in 1987, they almost got into fights with the Quebec poets because the Quebec poets were like, "He's ours, you know, he's Quebecois." And they were like, "What's happening?" Like the force of that reclamation was too much for them.
Well, I think we'll end on that note. Thank you for a really wonderful talk.